In 1993, twin brothers vanished from a gas station. 5 years later, a contractor found a hidden room in their stepfather's house. For Sarah, the 5 years had been a single, long day. A day that started with the slam of a car door and never ended. She existed in a fog of maybes and what-ifs, a haze that blurred the edges of her life until the only thing in focus was the absence of her sons, Leo and Sam. They were 10. They had the same laugh, the same gap between their front teeth, the same way of looking at her as if she were the only person in the world who mattered. Now, that look was just a memory she replayed until it was worn and thin, like an old photograph. Her husband, Mark, the boy's stepfather, moved through the fog with her, but he seemed unaffected by it. While the haze swallowed Sarah whole, it seemed to beat up and roll off of him, leaving him dry and untouched. He went to work. He fixed the leaky faucet. He mowed the lawn every Saturday, the roar of the engine a jarring interruption to the suffocating silence of their home. He never spoke their names, not once in 5 years. It was as if Leo and Sam had been erased not just from the world, but from his memory too. The police had called it a stranger abduction, a crime of opportunity. The gas station was on a busy highway. The attendant remembered seeing the boys by the air pump while Mark paid inside. Mark came out, and they were gone, just gone. The attendant said Mark had looked frantic, screaming their names, running to the edge of the road. But Sarah, in the quiet, lonely nights, remembered the look on Mark's face when he came home with the police. It wasn't frantic, it was blank. A calm, empty expression that chilled her more than tears ever could. She told herself it was shock. Grief affects everyone differently. But the thought was a splinter in her mind, one she couldn't pull out. Something was wrong in the house. It was a feeling she couldn't shake, a coldness in the hallways, even in summer, a sense of being watched when she was alone. She would walk into the living room and feel a sudden drop in temperature, a weight in the air that made it hard to breathe. She told Mark about it once. He just said the house was old. He was a practical man. He had an answer for everything, but he couldn't explain the faint smell that sometimes drifted up from the basement, a sweet, sickly smell like old flowers and damp earth. He couldn't explain why he'd installed a new, heavy deadbolt on the basement door a year after the boys disappeared, telling her it was for security. Who were they keeping out? Or what were they keeping in? The years passed, and hope, a bright, fierce fire, dwindled to a pilot light, flickering weakly in the dark. Sarah learned to live with the ghosts of her children. Their jackets still hung on hooks by the door. Their sneakers were still tucked under the bench. Moving them felt like a betrayal, like admitting they were never coming back. So the house became a museum of a life that had stopped. And in the middle of it all was Mark, a silent curator, watching her with those empty eyes. She often wondered what he was thinking, what he was feeling. He was a locked room, and she didn't have the key. She would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and find him standing in the hallway, just staring at the wall, his hands clenched into fists. When she asked him what was wrong, he would just shake his head and go back to bed, leaving her alone with the cold air and the deafening silence. The police investigation had been a storm of activity that quickly faded to a drizzle, then nothing. Detective Miller, a man with tired eyes and a kind face, had been in charge. In the first few weeks, he had been a constant presence in their lives. He'd sat at their kitchen table, drinking lukewarm coffee, asking the same questions over and over. What time did you leave the house? Were the boys excited about the trip? Did they talk to anyone at the gas station? Sarah answered through tears, her voice hoarse. Mark answered in short, clipped sentences, his gaze fixed on a spot on the wall behind the detective's head. His alibi was perfect. The gas station attendant confirmed his story. The credit card receipt showed the exact time he paid for the gas. A truck driver had seen a beat-up blue van speeding away from the area around the same time, but the lead went nowhere. There were no other witnesses, no security cameras, just a 5-minute window where two boys ceased to exist. Detective Miller had looked at Mark with a thoughtful, probing stare. He asked him about his relationship with the boys. Mark said it was good. He said he loved them like his own. But Sarah remembered things differently. She remembered the way Leo would flinch when Mark entered a room too quickly. She remembered Sam growing quiet, his usual bubbly energy draining away whenever his stepfather was around. They were small things, easy to dismiss. Kids can be shy. Step-parenting is hard. She had made excuses because she wanted her new family to work. She had wanted to believe in the life she was building. But now, in the silence of her empty house, those small moments felt like warning signs she had ignored. She remembered one time, a few months before they disappeared. She had gone down to the basement to get a box of winter clothes and found Sam crying on the bottom step. He wouldn't tell her why. He just pointed at the far wall, a dark, damp corner behind the water heater, and whispered, "It's scary down here." Leo had come down then, putting a protective arm around his brother. He told her it was just a spider, but Leo's eyes had darted nervously toward the same corner, and he'd pulled his brother up the stairs with a strange urgency. After the disappearance, the town wrapped its arms around Sarah. Casseroles appeared on her doorstep. Neighbors offered condolences with sad, pitying looks. But as weeks turned into months, the sympathy soured into suspicion. Whispers followed her in the grocery store. People looked at Mark with a new, calculating gaze. Why was he so calm? Why did he go back to work so soon? The unspoken accusation hung in the air. The stepfather did it. It was always the husband or the boyfriend or the stepfather, but there was no evidence, nothing. Just a town's unease and a mother's gnawing doubt. Sarah felt herself shrinking, her world becoming smaller until it was just the four walls of her house. A house that felt less like a home and more like a tomb. She stopped going out, unless she had to. The pitying looks were too much to bear. She drifted through her days, a ghost in her own life, haunted by the memory of two laughing boys and the cold presence of the man she shared a bed with. One night, she found him in the basement. The deadbolt was undone. He was standing in front of that same dark corner the boys had been scared of, just touching the concrete wall with the palm of his hand, his expression unreadable. Life with Mark became a slow, quiet torture. The house was a pressure cooker of unspoken words and buried fears. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh in the night, felt significant. Sarah started watching him, studying him the way a scientist studies a strange new species. She noticed things she'd never seen before, or maybe had refused to see. He had routines. Every night after dinner, he would go out to the garage for exactly 1 hour. She could hear the faint sound of tools, the scrape of metal on concrete. If she ever asked what he was doing, he'd just say he was tinkering. He had a small workshop out there, filled with saws and drills and heavy, dangerous-looking equipment. He kept it obsessively neat. Everything had its place. The garage was his sanctuary, and she was not welcome in it. The basement was another forbidden zone. After he'd installed the deadbolt, he was the only one who ever went down there. He told her it was too damp, that it was bad for her allergies. He would go down once a week, always on a Sunday afternoon, and be gone for 20 or 30 minutes. She could hear faint thuds and scrapes from below, but she could never make out what he was doing. The silence in the house was the worst part. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket. They ate their meals without speaking. They watched television without commenting. They lay in bed at night, separated by a chasm of grief and suspicion. Sarah felt like she was screaming on the inside, a constant, high-pitched wail of pain and confusion. But on the outside, she was as still and quiet as he was. Her suspicion began to feed on these small, strange details. Why was he so secretive about the garage in the basement? What was he doing in there? The questions looped in her mind, driving her to the edge of madness. She started to feel like the police, like her neighbors. She started to believe the whispers. One afternoon, while Mark was at work, a desperate curiosity finally won out over her fear. She went into the garage. The air was thick with the smell of oil and sawdust. It was, as always, immaculate. Tools hung in perfect rows on a pegboard. Screws and nails were sorted into little plastic bins, all neatly labeled. It was the garage of a man who needed control. As she looked around, her eyes fell on his main toolbox, a big red metal chest. A thought, ugly and insistent, pushed its way into her mind. She had to look. Her hands trembled as she lifted the heavy lid. Inside were trays of wrenches and screwdrivers, all lying in their designated foam cutouts. She lifted the top tray, and then she saw it. Tucked into a corner, almost hidden beneath a greasy rag, was a single dirty shoelace. It was white with a green dinosaur pattern. It was Leo's. She remembered buying him the sneakers they belonged to just a month before he disappeared. He had loved them. He'd been so proud of learning to tie the laces himself. Sarah stared at it, her heart pounding in her chest. How did it get here? In Mark's toolbox. She felt the floor tilt beneath her, the world going fuzzy at the edges. It was just a shoelace. It could have fallen off any time. It could have been in the car and gotten stuck to his boots. There were 100 rational explanations, but none of them felt right. This felt different. This felt like a secret. She quickly put it back, closed the toolbox, and fled the garage, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The shoelace was a piece of physical proof. A tiny, insignificant object that confirmed the terrifying feeling she'd had for years. Something was wrong. Something was terribly, horribly wrong with Mark. That evening, the shoelace burned a hole in her mind. She couldn't eat. She couldn't think. The sight of Mark sitting across from her at the dinner table, calmly eating his mashed potatoes, made her stomach turn. He was a stranger, a man with a monster hiding behind his eyes. She waited until he was settled in front of the TV, his attention fixed on some bland sitcom. She walked into the living room, her hands clenched at her sides. Her voice, when it came out, was a thin, reedy thing she barely recognized. "I was in the garage today," she said. Mark didn't look away from the screen. He just grunted in response. "I found something," she pushed on, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I found Leo's shoelace. In your toolbox." For a moment, there was only the sound of the canned laughter from the television. Then Mark slowly turned his head. His face was a blank mask, but his eyes were cold and hard as stone. He said, "It must have gotten stuck to my boot from the car." "Don't be ridiculous, Sarah." His voice was flat, dismissive. He made it sound like she was the one who was crazy, like her grief was making her see things that weren't there. A wave of hot anger washed over her, momentarily drowning out the fear. "Don't you dare," she hissed. "Don't you dare act like this is nothing. How did it get in your toolbox, Mark? How?" He stood up then, his tall frame looming over her. The calm was gone, replaced by a flash of something dark and ugly. "I told you," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Drop it." He took a step toward her, and for the first time in their marriage, Sarah felt a physical fear of him. She shrank back, her anger vanishing as quickly as it had come. She saw in his eyes that she had pushed too far. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving her shaking in the glow of the television. The confrontation changed everything. The thin pretense of a normal life they had maintained was shattered. Now, There was only open hostility and fear. Sarah felt like a prisoner in her own home, constantly watched by her jailer. The house, which had once felt haunted by ghosts, now felt actively malevolent. She was trapped with the monster, and she had let him see that she knew. Her suspicion became an obsession. She began searching for more evidence, for something, anything, that would prove what she knew in her gut to be true. While Mark was at work, she searched his closet, his office, the deep dark corners of the house she had avoided for years. She found nothing. He was careful. Whatever his secrets were, he kept them well hidden. Her world shrank to the size of her fear. The days were long, filled with a tense, waiting silence. The nights were worse. She would lie awake, listening to his steady breathing beside her, wondering what horrors were locked away behind his placid face. She started locking her bedroom door at night, a flimsy barrier that offered little real protection but gave her a sliver of peace. He never commented on it. He just slept on the couch, his silent presence on the other side of the door, a constant, menacing reminder of her captivity. The house was no longer a place of grief. It was a place of terror. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every noise was a potential danger. She felt her sanity fraying at the edges, worn thin by the constant, unrelenting stress. She was alone with her terrible knowledge, with no one to turn to and nowhere to go. She had accused him, and he had threatened her into silence. She was trapped. 5 years. It felt like a lifetime. The grief had settled deep in her bones, a permanent ache that never went away. The fear had become a constant companion, a shadow that followed her from room to room. Sarah had finally reached her breaking point. She couldn't live like this anymore. She couldn't spend another day in this house, breathing the same air as the man she was now certain had taken her children. She decided to sell the house. The thought of leaving the only home her boys had ever known was agonizing, but the thought of staying was unbearable. She told Mark she wanted a divorce. She wanted to move away, to start over somewhere new. To her surprise, he didn't fight her. He just nodded, his expression unreadable as always. He agreed to sell the house and split the money. It was almost too easy. His lack of resistance was more unsettling than an argument would have been. A realtor came, a cheerful woman whose bright energy felt alien in the grim, silent house. She walked through the rooms, making notes on a clipboard, talking about curb appeal and staging. Sarah just nodded along, a hollow feeling in her chest. To sell the house, they needed an inspection. A man named Dave, with a friendly smile and calloused hands, came to check the foundation, the wiring, the plumbing. He was the one who would change everything. Sarah was in the kitchen, packing boxes, when Dave called up to her from the basement. "Ma'am, can you come down here for a second? There's something you should see." A knot of dread tightened in her stomach. She walked slowly to the basement door, her footsteps echoing in the silent house. The heavy deadbolt Mark had installed was unlocked. She descended the creaky wooden stairs into the damp, musty air. Dave was standing in the far corner, the same corner the boys had been afraid of. He was tapping on the concrete wall with a small hammer. "Listen to this," he said, and tapped again. Thud, thud, thunk. The last sound was different. It was hollow. "That's not right," Dave said, his brow furrowed. He tapped along the wall, tracing the edges of the hollow sound. It seemed to be a perfect rectangle, about 4 feet high and 3 feet wide. "There's a void back here. Maybe an old coal chute they walled up." He took a crowbar from his tool belt. "You mind if I take a look?" It could be a structural issue. Sarah could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. She watched as he jammed the end of the crowbar into a thin crack near the floor and pushed. The concrete was just a thin layer of plaster over something else. It cracked and crumbled, falling away in dusty chunks. Behind it was not stone, but wood. Old dark planks of wood that formed a small makeshift door. It had no handle, just a small hole drilled through the center. Dave shone his flashlight on it. "It looks like it's been sealed up for a long time," he said. He worked the crowbar into the edge of the wooden door and pried. It resisted for a moment, then groaned open with the sound of splintering wood and rusted nails. A smell poured out of the opening. A thick, cloying, sickeningly sweet smell of decay and dust and something else, something horrible. Dave recoiled, coughing. "What in God's name is that?" He shone his flashlight into the blackness beyond the door. Sarah took a hesitant step forward, peering over his shoulder into the dark. Her heart stopped. It wasn't a coal chute, it was a room. A small, hidden crawlspace. And inside were the ghosts of her children. The light from the contractor's flashlight cut a shaky beam through the darkness, illuminating a scene from a nightmare. The space was tiny, no bigger than a closet. The floor was littered with objects that stole the air from Sarah's lungs. A small, worn teddy bear, its button eyes staring blankly into the dark. A pile of comic books. A red plastic dinosaur, the same one Sam used to sleep with every night. And clothes. Piles of small t-shirts and jeans, folded neatly, as if waiting to be worn. Sarah's mind refused to process what she was seeing. It was a tableau of her children's lives, a secret museum of their last days. The contractor, Dave, swore under his breath and took a step back, his face pale. I think you need to call the police," he stammered, his professional demeanor gone. Sarah didn't move. She couldn't. She was frozen, her eyes glued to the scene in the crawlspace. Then the flashlight beam moved, sweeping across the back wall, and she saw the drawings. The walls were covered in them, childlike scribbles in crayon and what looked like charcoal. They were drawings of a family. A stick-figure mommy with bright yellow hair, a tall, blocky stick-figure daddy, and two smaller stick figures, always standing off to the side, their faces drawn with downturned weeping mouths. In every picture, the two small figures were alone, separated from the others, their hands reaching out for nothing. Beneath one of the sad little drawings, a single word was scratched into the wood, over and over again, the letters gouged deep. Sorry, 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 sorry. The word pulsed in the dim light, a desperate, silent scream. That's when Sarah finally broke. A sound tore from her throat, a raw, animal noise of pure agony. She collapsed to the dusty concrete floor, the strength gone from her limbs. The world dissolved into a blur of flashing lights and distant voices. She was vaguely aware of Dave making a frantic call, of sirens wailing in the distance, of footsteps pounding down the basement stairs. Detective Miller was there. His face, now etched with more lines, swam into her vision. He knelt beside her, his voice gentle but firm. "Sarah, we need you to go upstairs. We have to secure the scene." She couldn't speak, could only shake her head, her gaze still fixed on that dark, horrifying opening in the wall. The police swarmed the basement. Yellow tape went up. Men in white suits moved carefully, their faces grim. They brought in bright lights that flooded the small space, revealing every terrible detail. They started bringing things out in evidence bags. The teddy bear, the dinosaur, a worn pair of sneakers with green dinosaur laces, and then a small white bone. It was then that the full, crushing weight of the truth landed on her. They hadn't run away. They hadn't been taken by a stranger in a blue van. They had been here the whole time. They had been in the house, just feet beneath where she slept, trapped in that tiny, dark room. While she had grieved, while she had prayed for their return, they were here. Mark. The name was a venomous whisper in her mind. He had known. He had put them there. He had walked over their hidden grave every single day for 5 years. The deadbolt on the door. The strange smells. his secret trips to the basement. It all clicked into place, forming a picture so monstrous it defied belief. He hadn't just taken her sons, he had kept them. He had curated their memory in a secret tomb and lied to her face every single day. The calm, quiet man she had married was a monster of unimaginable cruelty. The hours and days that followed the discovery were a chaotic blur. The house was no longer hers. It was a crime scene. Forensic teams worked meticulously in the basement, cataloging every speck of dust, every fiber, every heartbreaking piece of her children's lives. Sarah stayed with a neighbor, wrapped in a blanket on a couch that wasn't hers, staring at a wall that wasn't hers, feeling completely detached from her own body. Detective Miller came to see her. He sat across from her, his expression heavy with a sorrow that mirrored her own. "We found them, Sarah," he said softly. The words were meant to bring closure, but they only brought a fresh wave of pain. The medical examiner confirmed what they already knew. The bones found in the crawlspace belonged to Leo and Sam. The official search was over. But a new, more horrifying search was just beginning. The search for why. Mark was arrested at his workplace. They took him away in handcuffs, his face the same placid, empty mask it had always been. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He offered no confession, no denial, no explanation. He simply went with them, leaving a void of unanswered questions behind him. The focus of the investigation shifted to the crawlspace itself. It was more than a tomb. It was a message, a twisted psychological puzzle that the investigators tried to piece together. The drawings were the most disturbing part. The psychologists who analyzed them said they depicted feelings of extreme isolation and fear. The two small figures, always separated, always sad, were clearly Leo and Sam. They were trapped in a world where their mother was present but unreachable, and their stepfather was a looming, dominant figure. The drawings showed a profound emotional neglect that bordered on terror. They were the artwork of children who were desperately unhappy and afraid. And then there was the word sorry scratched into the wood. Was it the boys apologizing for some imagined transgression? Or was it the killer, a fleeting moment of remorse in an act of pure evil? The detectives leaned toward the latter. It was a clue to the mind of the man who had built this prison. They analyzed the contents of the room. The clothes were clean, folded. The toys were arranged, not scattered. It wasn't a place of frantic struggle. It was a place of quiet, long-term imprisonment. The evidence suggested the boys had been kept alive in that space for some time. Days, weeks. The thought was unbearable. Sarah pictured them in the dark, cold space, just a few feet away from her, crying for her, and she had never heard them. She had lived her life right on top of their suffering. Had she missed a sound? A cry in the night that she dismissed as the house settling? The guilt was a physical weight, crushing her chest, making it impossible to breathe. The story of the blue van at the gas station had been a lie. A carefully constructed story to send the police and the world looking in the wrong direction while the truth was hidden in his own basement. He had played the part of the grieving stepfather, a performance so convincing that for a time, everyone believed him. He had watched Sarah suffer, had held her while she cried, all while knowing their sons were entombed beneath their feet. The cruelty of it was bottomless. It was a kind of evil she didn't know existed. Mark refused to talk. He sat in his interrogation room in a state of absolute silence, his eyes fixed on the two-way mirror, offering nothing. The detective showed him pictures of the crawlspace, of the drawings, of the bones of his stepsons. He didn't flinch. He didn't react at all. It was like he wasn't there. Detective Miller, frustrated and haunted by the case, decided to dig deeper, not into the crime, but into the man. Who was Mark? Where did he come from? His life before he met Sarah was a blank slate. He had told her he was an only child, that his parents had died in a car crash when he was young. He said he was raised by a distant aunt. He never talked about his childhood. It was another locked room. Miller's team started digging through old records, birth certificates, school yearbooks, anything they could find from Mark's past. And they found it. A small town in rural Pennsylvania. A birth certificate for Mark, but also another one. For the same day, the same parents. Mark wasn't an only child. He had a brother. An identical twin brother named Michael. There was no record of a car crash. His parents hadn't died. They were still alive, living in that same small town. And there was no record of a Michael after the age of 8. He had simply vanished from all official documents. Miller drove to Pennsylvania. He found Mark's parents, an elderly, broken couple living in a small, run-down house. At first, they were reluctant to talk. But when Miller told them about Leo and Sam, about the crawl space, the old woman began to weep. The story that unfolded was one of dark family secrets and a tragedy that had poisoned their lives. When Mark and Michael were 8 years old, they were playing hide-and-seek. Their father was a hard man, a violent alcoholic who would beat them for the smallest infraction. That day, he was in a rage. To escape him, Michael had hidden in an old abandoned icebox in their backyard. Mark had watched him crawl inside. He was supposed to be the lookout. But he got scared and ran, leaving his brother behind. The father never found Michael. No one did, until the next morning. The icebox had latched from the outside. Michael had suffocated. The family never spoke of it again. They told everyone Michael had gone to live with relatives. They erased him. Mark's father had blamed him, telling him it was his fault his brother was dead. The abuse got worse. Mark grew up in the shadow of that icebox, in the suffocating silence of a family destroyed by guilt and violence. And then Miller saw something that made his blood run cold. On the wall of the parents' living room was a faded framed photograph. It was a school picture of 2 little boys with identical faces. And behind them, a shadowy figure stood in the background, partially obscured. It was their father watching them. It was the same shadowy figure from the drawings on the crawlspace wall. The pieces clicked together with horrifying clarity. Mark wasn't just killing Leo and Sam. He was replaying his own nightmare. He was trying to fix the past. The boys, twins, just like him and his brother, had become props in his twisted psychological drama. The truth was more terrible than Sarah could ever have imagined. When Detective Miller laid it all out for her, the story of Mark's past, of his lost twin, of the abusive father, it didn't bring clarity. It brought a deeper, more profound kind of horror. Mark hadn't just been evil, he had been broken. He was a man trapped in the body of an 8-year-old boy, hiding from a monster that had followed him his whole life. Confronted with the story of his brother, Mark finally broke his silence. In a flat, emotionless voice, he confessed everything. The story he told was not one of rage or malice, but of a sick, twisted form of love. He saw his own abusive father in the world. He saw dangers everywhere. He believed that the world was going to take Leo and Sam, just like it had taken his brother, Michael. He became convinced that the only way to keep them safe, to protect them, was to hide them away where no one could ever find them. The day they disappeared, he hadn't taken them to the park they were supposed to go to. He had brought them home, to the basement. He told them it was a new game, a secret clubhouse game. He had built the crawl space for them, a fort to keep them safe from the bad men outside. He would bring them food and water. He gave them their toys and crayons to keep them occupied. He was their protector. But the game became a prison. The boys cried. They begged to see their mother. They didn't understand. And Mark, his mind fractured by his own trauma, couldn't understand why they weren't grateful. He was saving them. In his delusion, he was doing what he had failed to do for his own brother. He was being the lookout. The word sorry scratched on the wall wasn't his apology to the boys for killing them. It was his apology to his dead brother, Michael, for failing to save him. He was trying to atone for his childhood sins by recreating the tragedy, but this time with a different outcome. He would keep them safe forever. But he couldn't. The secret was too hard to keep. The boys got sick. In the damp, cold air of the crawlspace, they developed pneumonia. Mark didn't know what to do. Taking them to a doctor would reveal his secret. So he did nothing. He watched them get weaker, his plan to protect them turning into a slow, agonizing death sentence. He watched them die. And then he sealed the wall. He had failed again. He had lost another set of brothers. So he kept their things, folded their clothes, and created a shrine. He would visit them on Sundays, sitting in the dark basement, talking to them, apologizing not to them, but through them, to the ghost of his own past. He told the gas station attendant he was frantic, because that's how he thought a father should act. He performed grief for the world, while his real emotions were locked away in that basement. A tangled mess of guilt, fear, and a deranged sense of duty. The story was a closed loop of tragedy, a cycle of pain passed down from one generation to the next. The shadowy figure in the boys' drawings wasn't a monster from their imagination. It was the ghost of Mark's father, a specter of violence that had reached out from the past to claim 2 more innocent lives. There was no trial. Mark pleaded guilty to everything. His confession, a quiet, rambling monologue delivered in a monotone voice that chilled everyone in the courtroom. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Justice was served, the newspaper said. The town could finally heal. But for Sarah, there was no healing. Closure was a lie. Knowing the truth didn't mend her shattered heart. It just gave her more ghosts to live with. Not just the ghosts of her sons, but the ghost of Mark's brother, Michael, and the long, dark shadow of his father. She sold the house. She couldn't bear to set foot in it again. She packed her life into a few boxes, leaving behind the furniture, the dishes, the entire physical record of the life she had built there. It was all tainted. It was all part of the crime scene. Before she left for the last time, she went through one final box of the boys' things that the police had given back to her. School papers, drawings, things that had been in their bedrooms, untouched by the horror in the basement. At the bottom of the box, she found a piece of paper, folded in half. It was a drawing from Leo. On the front, he had drawn a picture of a bright blue sky with a smiling sun. Inside, he had drawn their family. There she was, with her yellow crayon hair. There was Sam, holding her hand. And there was Mark, standing next to them. In Leo's drawing, Mark was smiling. He wasn't a blocky, looming figure. He was just a dad. At the bottom, in a child's wobbly handwriting, it said, "My new family. I love my new dad." The drawing was dated just a few weeks after she and Mark had gotten married. It was a picture of a time before the darkness had fully taken hold. A brief moment of hope. A memory of a life that could have been. Sarah held the piece of paper, the innocent drawing a stark contrast to the horrific images scribbled on the crawlspace walls. She saw it all then, the happy beginning, the creeping fear, the monstrous end, the love her sons had tried to give him, and the trauma he had given them in return. The tears finally came, not the frantic, hysterical tears of her early grief, but slow, quiet tears of a sorrow so deep it had no bottom. She was crying for her sons. She was crying for the little boys Mark and his brother had once been. She was crying for the beautiful, simple hope in a child's drawing. She left the town and never went back. The house was eventually torn down, replaced by an empty lot where grass grew over the scar in the earth. But the story remained, a dark legend whispered in the town, a cautionary tale about the monsters that can hide behind a neighbor's smile, and the secrets that can be buried just beneath your feet. Have you ever heard a story that stayed with you like this? Share your thoughts below.